Hey, this is Alex Head, founder of Subtext Radio.
This is Subtext.
Please go ahead and click the like button and the subscribe button. It really helps us to reach new audiences and promote the artists that we work with. Hit like and hit subscribe. Okay, welcome back to the Subtext End of 2020 broadcast. It's been one hell of a year. Coming up is the Bad Gays episode on Mayor Pete. This episode features Mac Folks, who, for those of you who are unaware, actually passed away in March of 2020, immediately prior to the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic, the uprisings and protests of Black Lives Matter in the United States and around the world, and of course, finally, the loss of the election by the current sitting US president. Folks was born in Jamaica. He moved to New York in the 70s and finally settled in Berlin, where he was a foundational figure of the city's burgeoning club scene in the 90s. Folks lived his life as an activist, supporting other pioneers in the struggle for black and queer rights. In 2016, he appeared in Mickey Blanco's short film High School Never Ends, which is actually a really interesting use of a Shakespearean tragedy set in the late 20th century race and gender conflicts of rural Germany. You can find that short film by Mickey Blanco on Vimeo. It's there for free. We'd like to thank Bad Gays and Edna Bonhomme, who's also a guest on this show, for giving us this opportunity to air the opinions and the critique of Folks once more. So without further ado, here's the man himself offering his critique alongside his peers in Bad Gays, the Iowa Caucus special, the Mayor Pete episode.
Hello, and welcome to another special guest episode of Bad Gays, a podcast where we uncover the dark side of gays and queer folks in history. I'm Ben Miller, a writer, historian, and member of the board of the Schwules Museum in Berlin. There's a kind of conversation I used to have when working in offices with large gay populations. The conversation happened frequently enough that I began to be able to predict how it might unfold. An older gay male colleague, typically white and trim and successful, would set off on a lament about the impossible meanness and pettiness about gay culture, would speak from the heart about loneliness and feelings of inadequacy. Then, strangely, the conversation would turn to the idea, expressed with varying degrees of confidence and anger, that there was a subgroup of gays who had the wrong goals: too much sex with too many people, going to drag bars on a Tuesday night. These sorts were holding the good ones back from finally merging into the mundane, and, it was suggested, more fulfilling, everyday of bourgeois life. Maybe, I would suggest, the root of these colleagues' unhappiness wasn't evil sex radicals or unreconstructed sissies, but the impossible situation contemporary gays find ourselves in. The promise of acceptance and tolerance if we force ourselves into relationship models that often chafe. The way that rights of access to institutions like military service and marriage have divided us from queer and trans sisters and siblings. The gentrification of our community spaces out of major urban centers. Our own complicity, if we are white, and I am, and these men always were, in these same processes of gentrification, and the ingrained misogyny that leads to a drive towards hypermasculinity and thinness. No, the colleague would insist, it's just that bitchy mean gay culture. It's toxic. In the community, we have a name for these people: A-gays. They are at least normatively white. They enforce the social rules of a certain kind of gay space, implicitly, and sometimes explicitly, excluding all other kinds of gays and all other kinds of queer people who don't fit their strange standards. These are the donors and board members of the big gay nonprofits, the setters of the mainstream gay agenda. Sarah Schulman has written of a gentrification of the mind of queer movements in the 1990s in Benjamin Shepherd, An Assimilationist Split. Under the pressure of the AIDS epidemic, with a generation of leaders dead, some people turned to radical and radically inclusive activism. Others, people who had been in what Mike Signorile once called the closets of power, rich, white, gay, and lesbian couples who distanced themselves from any kind of activism that threatened their social positions by destroying their ability to remain respectfully discreet. These people swept in the early 1990s and started what we now think of as the gay rights movement, organizations like the Human Rights Campaign. And they still won't be associated with mass organizing or endorse the kinds of comprehensive social and economic justice agendas required to end, rather than just name, the physical and economic violence that is habitually done to queer folks by individuals and the state. This is how you get a democratic presidential LGBT town hall where no black trans women are allowed to ask questions and where they are removed by event security for protesting that silence. So this is how I want to frame our conversation today, which is about someone that I sometimes think was created by scientists in a lab to embody this kind of gay man and his countless faults, failings, and collaborations with power and with evil. Yes, this is the Mayor Pete episode. I think about these gays when I think about the particular complicity of and terrible politics of Pete Buttigieg, and also about his seemingly profound discomfort with being gay. Consider the report last week that the campaign canceled an event at a Rhode Island gay bar because they wouldn't remove their dancer poles for the night. The bar wasn't insisting on having people dance on the poles all night, but the campaign insisted that just the existence of that kind of object, an object reminding people of drag and sex work and go-go boys and all those inconvenient parts of being gay, made their literal presence in the space impossible. Now, I couldn't possibly have this conversation alone or do this alone. My head would explode, and it wouldn't be right to only have one voice, I think. So I've invited two really fantastic special guests to join me for this conversation, and I want to introduce you to them now. First off, Mac Folks, who was born in Jamaica, raised in New York City, has lived here in Berlin for many years, and has been a foundational member of our queer nightlife scene. And after working for many years in that scene and in fashion, he's moved on to pursue a career as an artist, focusing his practice on race and culture. He consistently says some very smart and sharp things, and I'm very happy to have him with us.
Hi, Ben. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. And secondly, I want to introduce Dr. Edna Bonhomme. Edna is a Haitian-American scholar, writer, and art worker who is currently a postdoctoral fellow at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin, where she is working on a book manuscript about sanitary imperialism in traditional medicine and collaborating with decolonial artists, writers, and activists. Let me tell you, this girl is everywhere all the time, doing all the things in amazing ways. She completed her PhD at Princeton University in 2017 and has written for Africa as a Country, The Nation, and The Baffler. And she also hosts the brilliant podcast Decolonization in Action, which you can find on your podcast app when you finish listening to this show, and which also very graciously is letting us use their equipment to record this episode. So welcome, Edna, and thank you for that.
Thank you for having me, and I really enjoy listening to bad gays.
We don't love bad gays.
Well, I think this is a bad gay that we don't love so much.
No, the podcast we like. The bad
yeah.
gays, not so much.
There are, and it's funny, I mean, there are some people that we profile that we end up developing a kind of strange affection for as the show goes on. As we research the episode, their motives become maybe easier to understand, or we start to become pleasant. And this, as I was working on kind of putting together the outline for this conversation, I just found myself getting angrier and angrier and more distance from this guy and angrier. So I figured I would just start by asking the two of you kind of how Mayor Pete as a concept first entered into your kind of perception and what your kind of first impressions were and have been, and then we can kind of move through his biography and talk about some of the stuff in more detail.
I mean, I think it's funny that you say Mayor Pete as a concept, because I think that's exactly what he is. He doesn't come across as a real person to me. I mean, he comes off as a sort of like a checkbox of like check, 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 you know? And I remember the first time that I saw him, I thought to myself, I know that girl. Yeah, I went to Cornell with that girl. You know what I mean? I was just like, and it was just like, he was a kid in the front of the room that was raising his hand and, trying, had all the information, but actually didn't really bring anything else to the conversation. He was able to sort of like repeat things. I try these days to act more on instinct than anything else. And I think as a sentient being, I try to get back to that feeling just like of being able to look at people and funny that you mentioned I work in queer nightlife. And one of the things that I was the doorman, and what that job enabled me to do was to be able to like slice somebody up and make snap decisions like that. And so it's a skill that you honed after a while because you have to make a really good decision. And I remember the first time I saw him, and the deal breaker, it was like Harvard, Rhodes Scholar, and then it was that picture of him with the gun in Afghanistan. And I was like, what the fuck is that? Can we say fuck on here?
Oh, we can say anything we want. We mark all our episodes as explicit.
It was really one of those. Truly, this is before I even knew that he didn't come out until he was 33 or something like that. I thought, what is a Harvard Rhodes Scholar doing with a gun in Afghanistan? A completely disavowed, engagement. And I was like, what is he trying to do there? And I just saw like this white gay dude, like picked up a gun to go aim it at brown people. And that really annoyed me.
And then the way that he would frame that, I remember he's spoken about gun control sometimes and sort of framed, the weapons that I used in Afghanistan don't belong on our streets. Well, they belong in Afghanistan.
Right. Exactly. They're on Afghani streets, right? Yeah. These are the things that I don't really sort of understand when people like him have these conversations. It's like the same thing when people say, like, well, Hillary's a feminist. And I'm just like, really? When she voted for that war in Iraq? It's just like, didn't she think that there were women there? So I don't really understand the disconnect. Like, they see the things through the lens of where they're from, but they somehow can't apply those same filters to other places.
Yeah, in many ways what you're describing is that the kind of homonationalism, what Jasper Poir describes as homonationalism, where people who might be queer in the global north, places like the United States, Europe, who want to align themselves with the ruling class, more so with the queer, gay folk in the global south, in Afghanistan, Iraq, Lebanon, Palestine, etc., that it causes a situation in which they rather fulfill the legacy of imperialism than to actually be in solidarity with working class, poor, and global south queer folk. And that is a contradiction that Mayor Pete is living through. But
is like embodying.
Yeah, he's embodying. But I would to answer your question with respect to when did I first come across him. So I've only known about him as a concept or as a figure, because I like what you said, as a concept, for about a year when I read Sarah Markus's article in The Nation describing Pete not just from his political lens, but from his father, and like how does he come to be the son of a University of Notre Dame professor, and then some of the things that you said, and with reference to him being a Rhodes Scholar, etc., and his proximity to a certain kind of upper class elitist politics and basically carrying the torch of neoliberalism is very much something that is at the heels of 30 years of academia moving to the right, politics moving to the right. We haven't really won in the U.S. context, at least, with respect to increasing wages more broadly. And so there's a way in which a certain kind of assimilation and what I would call respectability politics within the LGBT community has also been the thing to help create him as an individual. For me, as I dug deeper into who this person is, mayor of a town of like 100,000 people, barely 100,000 people. And it's just to go, so when one goes beyond and to think about, okay, Indiana, that's the fourth largest city in Indiana. And he goes from thinking, I want to be the president of an entire nation of 330 million people somehow, without fully understanding dynamics. And then even beyond that, with South Bend, it's, I also, because I'm a historian, I'm like, going to this black hole. The people who were there before white settlers were there were the Miami tribe, indigenous tribe. And that matters a lot to me because I'm from Miami. And I was trying to get a sense, what is the percentage of Native people there? Less than 1%. What is the percentage of black folk? 20%, 60% white. How does he address the constituency that doesn't reflect him and his demographic? And that is something that I'm very suspicious of.
He doesn't at all, I think, because we're going to get into later into the show when looking at his record as mayor, what there is of it. So now might be a good time to kind of bring the conversation into his biography. One funny note just before we begin is that, and I'll also say to our listeners that, as always, the sources that we relied on are going to be available in the show notes and linked and organized. But an article by Ashley Feinberg on Slate revealed that he actually was regularly editing his own Wikipedia page to kind of add new biographic updates and edit. So, yeah, just, he is. As, Mac said earlier, I saw him and I knew her. That was the one at the front of the class. And Edna said, this middle-class family. So this is a kid who's born in South Bend, Indiana, which is a deindustrializing Rust Belt city. He does not grow up in the deindustrializing parts. He grows up in the kind of leafy suburban parts, the kind of part of town that I actually myself grew up in. It was, according to the AP, I quote, a running joke in his U.S. history class at St. Joseph High School. Would he use his own last name when he ran for president, or would he change it so that it would be better? And I think that tells you a lot. He was named high school valedictorian, of course, voted senior class president, of course, and chosen most likely to be U.S. president, of course. As I mentioned, he grew up in this sort of leafy suburban part of South Bend, which is the cluster of neighborhoods around the University of Notre Dame, where his parents had academic jobs, and he was educated consistently at private schools, which were much whiter and wealthier, of course, than the surrounding community. His father, interestingly enough, Edna, you mentioned he's an academic, and his father's actually a leftist academic of some renown, was a translator of Gramsci, I believe, the Prison Notebooks.
Prison Diaries.
Prison Notebooks.
Yeah. Which, I mean, those of us who spent time...
The English version,
the translator. Those of us who spent time around academia know that the fact that people work on radical topics does not necessarily mean that they live
radical lives.
Those lives.
Or that their children will inherit radical politics.
Right.
Yeah.
The father of Kamala Harris, I'm forgetting his name now, but was also he was at UC Berkeley, right?
Berkeley, yeah.
Yeah.
And her school was she was one of the first people to help integrate the Berkeley public school system.
Yeah.
But it's fascinating when you go to, of course, I went to university a very, very long time ago, but there is this, when you're in that kind of place and you're up on the hill, like, so I went to Cornell, it's like a big, it's like up on the hill. And then you've got this very, very wide gap between who goes to the university and who lives in the town, right? Mm-hmm. And they call them townies. And what's fascinating is, I guess he actually lived there, but most of the people that live there are transient, right? So they come and stay for a couple of years and then they leave. So it's this kind of thing when they never really connect with what's going on. And there's always this kind of, hands off. So I don't even know if you're even in that kind of place. You already set up this us-them. Not that this us-them isn't everywhere, but I think it's super reinforced in this kind of, this place of academia, because people walk around academia like that anyway. Right, you went to Columbia, right? So you have the same experience in Harlem, right?
Yes. Yeah, there's a great divide between those who want to align themselves with the elite, or perhaps create the foundations to be part of Wall Street or work as an investment banker of some sort, versus those who have been disenfranchised and continue to be so in neighborhoods outside of Yale, Harvard, Duke University, and Columbia.
And I actually think that divide is so central to American liberal politics. The university expert, the kind of figure of the university expert, as early as the Progressive era in the early 20th century, and then certainly in the 1960s and 1970s with the kind of reorientation of the Democratic Party around highly educated knowledge workers or skills workers. The university expert or the professor becomes the kind of central subject of American liberal politics, and then there are poor and working people who are only sort of victims potentially to that politics, who are spoken of and over but never particularly heard from, and are certainly not invited to be part of any kind of collective liberation. And so I think it's interesting that Pete is like from birth, literally, and then goes on, as we'll see, to be embedded in these kind of institutions that are kind of reproducing these contradictions that are at the center of American liberal politics.
There is, of course, there's a liberalism within universities or a liberalism in the U.S. Politics as a whole that can be problematic for actually having true liberation or addressing the divisions based on race, class, etc. At the same time, there is a history for universities being the site of resistance. If we think about the May 68 student protests that were not just happening in places like New York or Berkeley, but were happening in Paris as well. And it was an international movement, and the site of the university as a place where you could gather, where you could potentially use the resources to occupy a building. And at Columbia, during the 68 kind of uprisings by students, they renamed some of the buildings to reflect Malcolm X, to reflect, and this was like Black students on campus, SDS, etc. And in some cases, they also united with Harlem residents to stop the formation of a gym called, and they're against Jim Crow. Mark Nason Mark Nason, and a historian, has written a little bit about this, as well as others who've looked at particularly the history of universities and student struggles being a situation in the 60s for liberation. How that looks like today is a bit different, and we see vestiges of that through things like the Black Lives Matter movement, Occupy movement, but it isn't necessarily the case that learning or having the space for intellectual struggle negates the possibility.
Oh, not at all. I didn't mean to make that point.
My biggest issue with that whole thing is that for so many people within those circles, these things are just academic exercises.
Mm-hmm.
They're just academic exercises, and they're just arguing a point, they're debating a point. And the reality is there's theory, and then there's really, there are lived lives on the ground. And somehow there's this disconnect, because you realize when you're speaking to them, oh, this is just a topic of conversation for them, like the weather.
Well, certainly, and if you're translating Gramsci and then sending your kid to private school, then,
I mean, Gramsci, I didn't really do my research, but my best girlfriend, when she did her PhD, I remember she coming home and talking about cultural hegemony all the time. And I was like, that's Gramsci, right? Like,
it is, yeah.
And we came to it, it was just like, well, Pete is the absolute, definition of cultural hegemony.
So just to move forward a little bit and obviously keep talking about these themes. So he goes to Harvard, of course, and a little bit about his time there that I think speaks to some of both what Edna was saying about the possibility for the university being this kind of site of resistance and struggle, and also to what Mac was saying about the ways in which it often isn't. So this is a quote, and this was excerpted in an article for Current Affairs that was written by Nathan Robinson, but this is a quote from Buttigieg's memoir about his life. The quote says this. So in April 2001, a student group called the Progressive Student Labor Movement took over the offices of the university's president, demanding a living wage for Harvard janitors and food workers. That spring, a daily diversion on the way to class was to see which national figure, Cornel West or Ted Kennedy one day, John Kerry or Robert Reich another, had turned up to encourage the protesters. Striding past the protesters on my way to a pizza and politics session with a journalist like Matt Bai or a governor like Howard Dean, I did not guess that the students poised to have the greatest near-term impact were not the social justice warriors at the protests, but a few mostly apolitical geeks who were quietly at work in Kirkland House." Unquote. And so, as Nathan Robinson points out, this is a very strange passage because, first of all, he's sort of diminishing the protesters as social justice warriors, but second, at no point does it cross his mind, like, I could join this, like, I could be part of this, like, this is something that I should, this is something that I should join in because if I'm a student at this elite school and I come from this elite background, the people who work here should be making a living goddamn wage.
They don't even see those people.
But some students, some
students absolutely.
Yeah.
But I think,
but this type of person doesn't see these people.
This class of people. My issue with a lot of these people is they actually don't believe in anything, right? They actually don't have any true convictions. and they don't have any true sort of like philosophies that they really live by. They've kind of like, it's this kind of like relativism, right? They just kind of like straddle the line, and whichever way's the wind blowing, they're going to go over here and they're going to go over there, and that is super, super problematic, particularly for myself as a Black person, that people have been, we talk about racism as this kind of like, oh, this theoretical thing, and like, oh, we don't do that, but no one ever fixes it, right? Mm-hmm. No one ever fixes it. No one ever talks about it. No one ever talks about it like outright. I did a reading last week, and I was in this room full of white people, and I called them white people, and everybody went, and I heard the air in the room went, and I was just like, yeah, you don't have a problem saying Latin music or Black culture, so why should I have a problem saying white people? And so when I think that how that transpires in the end is that white people tend to see themselves as individuals, in many, many, many ways. So joining groups tends to be a specific kind of thing, it's they're joining the groups that's going to get them to the next place, not necessarily joining the group because this is what I really.
Mm-hmm. Well, one thing I would say is I can definitely appreciate what you're describing, which is that there's a lack of solidarity on the part of some people to see the struggles of working class Black and Latinx and Indigenous folks, especially as they're fighting for a living wage. And we see a kind of national struggle within the U.S. context for the Fight for 15, mostly led by Black and Latinx women. And with respect to living wages on campuses, as particularly at elite universities that could absolutely afford to pay people higher wages. Harvard, #1 endowment in the world for universities, then Yale, and then Princeton. And the last time I checked, since I went to Princeton, their endowment was about $27 billion, which is higher than the GDP of Yemen, an entire country, and beyond an entire country. And so these are the inequalities that persist, where wealth and capital is maintained by these elite universities, and the endowment is separate from other kinds of funds. Beyond that, I would say, as someone who comes from a working class background, my father's a sanitation worker, my mom's a janitor at a hospital, and a lot of the women in my family are either domestic workers, janitors, migrants from the Caribbean, from Haiti specifically. And the fight for a living wage, especially since the economic crisis since 2008, has been one in which, for a fight for unionization. So on some of these college campuses, unions such as SEIU, Service Employee International Union, have been doing that work. And so often university campuses want to attack that. What has helped is when students are in solidarity to say we support these workers, or in some cases, if the university tries to prevent people from joining the union, they put a rat outside of the university to indicate their dismay. So the solidarity actions are absolutely key. And it sounds like Pete wasn't doing that when he was
actively walking, like not even considering that was something that you would do. Like that's what the social justice warriors do. But I'm the person who's going to run the world.
Well,
I'm the one who's going to be.
Well, why would he? He went to Harvard and Oxford, and he didn't come out. Do you know how many queens are there? I mean, like real talk, right? What do they say? Yeah, 1 in 4, maybe more, right? So it's not exactly that you're living in some sort of bubble. And my personal problem, because I think, I was born in 1965. I moved to America in 1970, so it was like right after what the projects of liberation, right? So like civil rights, women's rights, gay rights, and then, we have this sort of like the gay liberation movement, and then the gay liberation movement, and then we have the gay rights movement. And my mother was a very, very, very like instinctual person. And I was sitting with my mother like in the mid-90s sometime, and like she was having a real problem with the gay rights movement. And I remember like even at that time I really couldn't put pieces of the puzzle together, right? Because I just thought to myself, marriage in the military? Like of all the things, like those the two most oppressive institutions known to mankind, like that's what we're aligning ourselves with? Like It just didn't, and I completely did not have the language at that period of time to really discuss this thing, but it just hit me in the wrong way. And I remember the mother, they were always sort of referring back to the Civil Rights Act and the Civil Rights Movement, and referring back. And my mother said, quote, "Trust me, they're going to leverage our struggle to get what they want, and then they're going to cut us loose."
Yep.
And I was just like, I was stunned, when she said it, because, I'm living an intersectional life, right? And I'm sort of like black and gay, and I did not want to believe that about, my gay brothers, because, we'd also just come out of the, the ACT UP moment and, the AIDS, and really just struggling for survival. And, and I really thought we were in this together, and I didn't really want to believe them. And when I see them now, it's just like, wow, my mother was right once again. And then, and she's not alive anymore, but I would wish she was still here, so I could go like, wow, how did you call that?
Yeah, and what you're pointing to is just how divisive certain people within the gay and community are, or that there are different gay communities. Growing up in Miami, there were those of us who were black and queer, and particularly from the working class, and depending on who came out, some of my friends ended up on the streets and had to hustle to survive. And there are others who would come from Europe and, because it's Miami, go to the beach, spend all this money, and part of an elite structure. And you're right to say, and it was around this time, early 2000s, that people were fighting in Miami-Dade County. It was this group called Save Dade to promote marriage, which is totally fine. But how do you deal with that when there's the reality of trans women being murdered, when people are like gay people, youth were homeless? And the one thing of joy not one, but there are many places of joy in the Miami context for young queer people of color, was gay prom. There was this group called Pride Lands that allowed the space for gay prom. And I remember my junior year and senior year helping to organize that, and it was one of the most fulfilling things to do, because it was for us, by us, as opposed to older gays with money telling us what we should think and feel.
And because the club is actually a microcosm, right, of society. And if you're paying attention, you can really read lots of things. So, of course, at the beginning, before I moved to Berlin, in New York at the Paradise Garage and at Sound Factory, basically sort of like queer, black and brown spaces, right? It was all about dancing. And we accepted everyone as long as they were all about dancing. You know what I mean? It wasn't about cruising. It wasn't about anything. It was all about the music, and it was all about the dancing. And then at some point, when the Chelsea Queen arrived on the scene in the late 80s, right? The Chelsea Queen, like the buffed up ones, like these A-gays that we're talking about, they all of a sudden rolled into the club. And this is what they did. They danced in a circle with their backs to all of us. And that, in hindsight, of course I noticed it and it felt wrong, but in hindsight, what it says to me, they're telling me who they are and what their relationship is with me with their body language.
And that in some way was an announcement of what was going to happen to these politics. I mean, and I just to listeners, I mean, I think we have a fair number of queer listeners who are going to kind of instinctively get it, but just for people who might not get why we keep coming back to talking about like nightlife and dancing and like queer spaces and this show, and it might feel like a digression from like running through the biography of this person that we're trying to profile. I really want to tell you it isn't, because these spaces and these kinds of experiences that we're talking about are so foundational. And then you get this kind of generation of white gays who, it's like the next step. So you start by turning your backs on everybody else in the space, and then you just absent yourself from the space.
Well,
and you just
there's so many more of them. They come and then they take over the space.
You take over the space.
And then suddenly you feel uncomfortable in the space that you've built.
Right.
And then you have to leave. And this is I mean, that's just gentrification.
It is.
Well, it's just like, that's all it is.
And then they absent themselves from the space entirely and become part of a political structure and a social structure in which the idea of even there being a queer space, a mixed queer space, is kind of unthinkable. And that's where you get this presidential campaign showing up to do an event at what they know is a gay bar, and they just literally cannot deal with the fact that there's a pole that no one's going to be dancing on.
Exactly.
But that's like a reminder that maybe there was one of the nasty ones we don't like
because
was here.
They're in these spaces. They're not even really in these spaces, really taking part. They're just in these spaces, occupying space.
Yeah. To move on with the bio a little bit briefly, if I could, when Mayor Pete leaves Harvard, he becomes a Rhodes Scholar, of course, and that's
as one does.
Yes, and I want to quote. So one of the episodes of the show that we've done that people talk about the most and say they like the most is the episode we did about Andrew Sullivan. And I want to quote Andrew Sullivan on Rhodes Scholars, because if even Andrew Sullivan says this, then really you know what you're talking about. Quote, Rhodes Scholars possess none of the charms of the aristocracy and all of the debilities, fecklessness, excessive concern that peasants be aware of their achievement, and a certain hemophilia of character. They are the apotheosis of the hustling apple polisher, the resume-obsessed goody-goody, the epitome of the blue-chip nincompoop. End quote.
Et voila. Right? What did I say? I know that girl. Right? And that's the description of that girl.
I love it because that's the ultimate read.
and
I would say that as someone who loves a good hot take, that it also goes to show because, as you had mentioned previously, it sounds like Pete either edits or has someone on his team editing his Wikipedia page, which shows a certain kind of hubris and an aspirational characteristic that we see based off of his resume. And this is something that should be, I guess, questioned.
Yeah. And so until now, we've been talking a lot about things that have been... I think if you were listening to the episode up until now and you were not already a Mayor Pete skeptic, you might think that this conversation had been fairly or somewhat aesthetic or judgmental or kind of harping on things or beginning from this kind of place of suspicion. And here is where I want to start getting into some of the things that he has done and things that he has involved himself with that I think make the politics make a lot more sense and that I think have informed a lot of our skepticism about some of these life decisions and some of these kinds of ways of being in the world that we've been talking about. I want to do that by, again, quoting from Mayor Pete's memoir about finishing up his Rhodes Scholarship. He says, quote...
He's already got a memoir?
Yes.
He was like mayor of like a two-bit town and he's got a memoir?
Well, it's a running for president book. You know, they're all called...
Oh, right, you got to have that, right?
The one
check
on Veep was called Some New Beginnings, Our Next American Journey. They're all called something like that. But anyway, so here's the quote. The book is called Shortest Way Home. Quote, knowing that I would head back to America meant that there was less at stake for me in the grade, but I took pride in it, of course, bragging about the grade he got in his thesis, even while sensing that the time had come to learn what wasn't on the page and get an education in the real world, which is why I went to McKinsey.
That's the real world?
Well, it's a kind of real world. So McKinsey, for those of our listeners who don't know, is one of the largest consulting firms in the world, and it serves more than 2,000 institutions. It has consulted with 90 of the top 100 corporations worldwide. And if there has been a merger, a monopoly, a rise of advertising, a rising executive pay package, a plant automation, a corporate restructuring, or a mass layoff, McKinsey has probably had something to do with it. McKinsey is one of the kind of firms that has the purest allegiance to capital and its power. McKinsey is, and always has been, very willing to work with despotic governments and corrupt business empires. They recently had a contract with Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, ICE, in the U.S. to assist, quote, enforcement and removal operations, organizational transformation, and integrated consulting services. So that means that McKinsey is consulting on making enforcement and removal operations more efficient, i.e. making it easier to deport families from the United States.
Yeah, I would say that McKinsey is very much a broker of global capitalism, of what you described to be having intimate relationships with governments that have authoritarian regimes, as well as doing the work of furthering exploiting people and fine-tuning that at the level of this consulting multinational body. I'm sure there are some people who want to get rid of their debt, and when McKinsey presents themselves as having an opportunity maybe to travel, to work across different private and public sectors, that it could be quite appealing and provide financial security. At the same time, there are people who are part of the ruling class who enter into this space, and it provides them the cushion and the ability to then justify why they should end up being the head of the Clinton Foundation, or why they should be part of someone's board. And so,
or the mayor of South Bend, or the
or the
treasurer of
mayor of
Indiana,
South
as
Bend.
Pete said. And the idea that this is the real world is something, Mac, that you sort of responded to, because it's a real world for sure. I mean, it's a world that I think all three of us here wish we didn't live in, and are trying to change and want to change. But there's a description here that I just want to get on the air here by a former McKinsey analyst named Anand Giridharadas, who's just written a book called Winners Take All, about this kind of corporate world of people who think that they're doing good, and that world. And he describes this as market world. And he says, quote, "This is an ascendant power elite that is defined by the concurrent drives to do well and do good, to change the world while also profiting from the status quo. These elites believe and promote the idea that social change should be pursued principally through the free market and voluntary action, that it should be supervised by the winners of capitalism and their allies and not be antagonistic to their needs, and that the beneficiaries of the status quo should play a leading role in the status quo's reform."
Wow. Those kids drank the Kool-Aid, didn't they? And so you don't get a pass. You know? You don't get a pass. And where you really don't get a pass for me is when you're somebody like Mayor Pete. Because 3 weeks ago, he would have told me that his struggle was equal to my struggle, right? And he would have aligned himself like, oh no, you can't discriminate against me. And then once he's moved into the power position, flip into the other side, you know? And I take that super duper personally, because it's just like, oh, I can't trust you, right? Because like my mother said, you got what you want, and so you're good, right? Because I think also this thing, particularly with white gays, is I think the only thing that they were actually pissed off about was that they were not allowed the privilege that they thought they rightfully deserved. That's it. There was no solidarity, or like, they just used the argument. You know, everybody that comes after the civil rights uses that argument to base their argument on. But the reality is, they don't care. It's an argument, like you said. It's an academic exercise. Like when they chose marriage in the military, that was a decision, right? That was a calculated decision to have them appeal to the most, the broadest and the most middle class, and come across as the most,
And it was also a decision that was made by people who, and I think this is a way in which Mayor Pete is really connected to this history of this particular kind of gay organized, I mean, I hesitate to call it organizing, but kind of gay rights demand, is that, like Mayor Pete, these are people who, for much of their life, used their privilege to shield themselves from having to kind of come out in any kind of public way. So in the 1970s, there's a gay liberation movement in San Francisco, and then there's also plenty of rich queens in nice houses and nice condos who live on Nob Hill, who, everyone in the social circle knows. You read Armistead Maupin, Tales of the City, right? There's all these people, maybe everybody knows that, Bill and Mark live together, but, Bill and Mark also have an opera subscription, and Bill and Mark are friends with the mayor, and Bill and Mark aren't like those, dirty queens in the street or whatever. And then when so many people start dying, there's this moment of enforced solidarity where AIDS doesn't discriminate. I mean, access to healthcare is throughout the crisis a major kind of differential between people's experiences, but especially in the early years when there's no treatment.
I think
and no cure. It came to a point of life or death. So all these people are these people are kind of forced out of their closets of power into the movement, and then all of a sudden in 1996, boom, there is a drug.
Yeah.
These people can take the drug. But now that they've been welcomed into the movement, these are also people who never in their life have taken following orders from anybody else. And so these are the people who have come to kind of run it. And so then they lift off of the struggle and they take the mantle of the movement, quote unquote, with them. And Mayor Pete is no exception. And that's how you get, I mean, I'm sure McKinsey ranks very highly, along with ExxonMobil and Raytheon and Boeing and Goldman Sachs, on the Human Rights Campaign, great places to work if you're a homo list. And I'm sure they march in pride with their signs and, that's...
Rainbow Visa cards.
Yeah.
Yep.
The neoliberalism with the gay face is very similar to the neoliberalism with the feminist, so-called feminist face. And I think it's important for us to demarcate the, gay liberation struggles and the wonderful work that did happen and continues to happen from the 60s onwards and even beyond, versus the politics of people who want to further create the divisions that I would say Pete is doing.
Yeah. So in 2012, he becomes mayor of South Bend, and this is where we start to have a record that we can look at. What does it look like when this person, who we've spent some time talking about, and this politics that we spent some time talking about, runs a city? And mayors in the United States, for people who don't live in the United States who are listening, tend to be fairly powerful within their kind of jurisdiction. Mayors in the United States can do a whole lot on their own. They tend to control city budgeting. As in many deindustrializing cities, there are a lot of vacant and abandoned houses. And so in good old management consultant style, and Buttigieg actually describes this in his book as a classic example of data-driven management paying off. They decide that they are going to either repair or bulldoze 1,000 of these vacant or abandoned houses within 1,000 days. This is also a moment when a lot of economic development energy is being focused on downtown, and they're trying to prettify downtown South Bend to make downtown South Bend a great place to have your startup, or to open a foofy restaurant, or to have real estate investment and speculation. And the issue is, as this BuzzFeed article reports, there were a lot of people out in the neighborhoods who wanted to have a better home or a rehabbed home to live in. According to BuzzFeed, they found a system working against them, a city bureaucracy working against them, fines and penalties. Like they were not working with homeowners to bring homes up to code to rehab them. It was just like, oh, you can't get this up to code? Well, then, bam, we're going to bulldoze it. And so a lot of Black and Latinx-owned property ends up being literally bulldozed by the city. And there were suspicions, the article reports, that homes were targeted because they stood in the way of city-endorsed real estate development plans that stood to price out longtime area homeowners and renters.
Before even getting into like the technicalities of it, right? My first point of entry always is language, right? And you said his first act was to bulldoze houses, right? So he rolls in and he's rolling over people. And I think that when somebody, that's the sign they send you, it's like, oh, I see where we're going with this. It's just like sometimes you have to take people at face value, right? And you don't even have to really get into the ins and outs. Like, really, that's the first thing you decided to do. You didn't like fix a hospital or like find some daycare or.
Well, they also put $90 million into making downtown pretty for real estate investments, but then you bulldoze the houses out.
Yeah, but when they put that $90 million in, I'm sure it's for like a WeWork, right?
Yeah, of course.
You know what I mean? And then what happens is in all of these things, so you have people that are like, that have lived in communities for, decades and decades and decades, and they feel like strangers in their own home.
And there's an environmental racism component to this as well that I want to bring up, because I know this is something, Edna, that you've spent a lot of time thinking and writing about. But when these buildings were demolished, there were worries about dust, about lead paint. In South Bend, this is according to reporting by CNBC, rates of lead poisoning are among the worst in the nation. Nearly 4 in 5 of these homes that were being demolished were built before 1980 and had not been recently renovated. There's a lot of lead-based paint going on. In some areas of the city's northwest, which is where most of the poor people and people of color live, more than a quarter of the children exhibited elevated levels of lead in their blood over the last decade. And there's a quote from a local resident named Sean White who says, quote, "How is he going to run the whole country if he can't get his city right first? I ain't never seen the dude, tell him to chill with us for 3 or 4 days.
Yeah, I think there are many layers to this. One of them being that millions of people are still suffering from the housing crisis, economic crisis from 2008, to the point that the last statistic I read, there's about 9 million people who've had their homes either foreclosed upon or evicted. So that's a nationwide problem in which 80% of those people are Black and Latinx. And places like Florida, places in the South, places that have had to suffer from this are still dealing with issues around vacant or unoccupied homes, etc. So there's plenty of unoccupied homes in which people could easily live and be present and have what I would call more free housing or more government-based housing. But then what you're describing is an even more absurd phenomenon in which people are being poisoned in the places that they live in. And this is not entirely new. We see this with the financial cutbacks and austerity measures in Flint, Michigan, and the ways in which they allow for, in Flint, Michigan, Black working class families to be exposed to poisoned water. And subsequently what you pointed to, which is lead poisoning, asbestos, other forms of occupational and or home-related toxic substances can cause neurological damage to children, lifetime damage, long-term damages to other people, and that is a form of not just environmental racism, but it's a way of just creating a second-class citizenship of people who who should be able to live, breathe, drink water, and do basic things. And the fact that he is not only complicit in that act is, I would call it criminal, actually. And it's a disservice to his residents, working class, Black or otherwise, who are being subjected to this housing inequality. And we see right now in Oakland that Mothers for Housing are fighting for housing in the Bay Area. And that needs to be expanded vis-a-vis efforts and initiatives. And that struggle for housing is going to be an ongoing struggle in the context of the U.S.
You know, it's fascinating you say that because, you know, on top of where you're talking about the housing crisis in 2008, you know, I read somewhere that basically, you know, that was a depression. You know, while it was a recession for the country, it was a depression, you know, for Black people, because one of the only ways to really generate, you know, intergenerational wealth is through a home, right? So you buy the home with the hopes that this thing is, you know, you're going to be able to pass it down and make a profit, you know, and then, you know, dig yourself out of the, you know, and when you target certain communities, you know, for these, you know, for these kinds of things, once again, you are, you know, replicating the cycle that's been going on for 400 years. And when you say to me that you don't know that that's going to happen, I say you're lying.
And
what for me is, so I tried to also read about his housing plan a little bit, and what he's framing it as is this massive public investment in which there's going to be some
is this his current housing plan as a presidential candidate?
Exactly.
Just to clarify,
yes,
okay.
as part of his presidential candidacy, because in some ways to suggest or provide a plan that also works with capital is what a neoliberal might do, but the extent to which, even in his own city, he wasn't able to actually provide, you know, uniform, full housing for his citizens. How can we trust him to do that at the level of the federal government?
Right.
And
I mean,
people still haven't been able to do that because of racism.
And you can also look at, and you can, I mean, you could look at
Mayor Pete and racism.
Oh, I think we're there, and that's I think the main kind of theme of the conversation for the rest of the episode. Just to say briefly, I think you could imagine thinking of a political figure who had come into a city in a difficult situation, had been unable to fix everything, but where you could point to a record of really fighting the forces that are trying to impoverish the residents of the city and really trying to do something different around housing and land. You think of mayors like Mayor Labumba of Jackson, Mississippi, who has been pioneering some really radical and really interesting and really necessary and hopefully portable ideas about housing cooperatives and kind of decommodifying housing at a municipal level and what can you do on a municipality. Now, if he were running for president, I would be very into it, even though I'm sure there are still many units of housing in Jackson, Mississippi that are not up to the standard that people deserve to live in. But this is somebody, Mayor Pete is somebody who didn't even try. This is somebody where the entire plan is about generating higher real estate values downtown and generating gentrification, and not about, the goal of the plan is not to ensure safe and quality and affordable housing for the Black and brown and poor and working class residents of South Bend. And this is where we get into, I think, a place to transition into his record with the police. And there's a lot here. And I want to begin with another one of the first things he does as mayor, which is to demand the resignation of Darrell Boykins, who had been the city's first Black chief of police. And this has been written up in The Intercept. It's really good reporting The Intercept has done on Mayor Pete's record on policing writ large, and that's kind of the source that I've been using to research this record, and all of that is, again, linked in the show notes. Boykins ends up rescinding his resignation, and then Buttigieg demotes him from being the chief of police. He has later admitted that this was a mistake. He called it my first serious mistake as mayor. Now, at the time, Mayor Pete said he fired Boykins for his role in secretly recording some police phone lines. But that recording system had actually been there since before Boykins took up the position. He ended up suing the city for racial discrimination and winning a $50,000 settlement. Now, there's a city employee named Karen DePape who listened in on the recordings and transferred the conversations to tapes. And she said in 2012 that what she overheard, and 2012 was the year that Mayor Pete became Mayor Pete, and not just Pete, that what she overheard suggested very unethical behavior by police officers, including the use of racist language related to Boykins. Can you imagine? This has never been heard of ever before. She was the only person who it was thought had listened to significant portions of the recordings, and she was also fired by Mayor Pete for her part in this, and she won a $235,000 settlement. The story ended up being reported out by the Young Turks, which is a news outfit, and they ended up reporting that what's on those tapes is white officers discussing how now that there's this new young mayor in town, they are going to, using two of his big donors as go-betweens, get him to fire the police chief. One officer is quoted on the recordings as saying, quote, "It is going to be a fun time when all white people are in charge." Now, it's important to clarify that it was never alleged that Buttigieg was aware of this plan. He was never... in fact, it is alleged by even Karen DePape that he was not aware, that this was not something he was planning on doing, but it's certainly something that these officers saw as being present in his politics. And then does he end up firing the police chief? Yes, he does.
How do you not fire the first Black police chief and not have it support white supremacy? I don't understand how, that's not possible. And I think when you say that, you're not aware of that, then my question is then, why aren't you aware of that?
Right.
Right? Then that's my question. Okay, let's take it for conversation's sake. You're not aware of that. So I want to know, why aren't you aware of that? Because you're going to be mayor of all the people, and you understand, right? You understand the symbolism. You understand that Black and brown people have a different relationship to the police, so that when you do this is going to reverberate, right? Mm-hmm. And if you don't know that, I got a problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that particular story, I have a lot of mixed feelings and complicated feelings about it because of, as an institution, the police are very problematic because they're there to protect the property of the elites. And as an institution in the U.S., as they began in the 19th century, very much were about catching runaway slaves and ensuring that people who were indebted could somehow pay off the people who they were indebted to, that was fulfilled somehow, and using force and violence is part of the work that they do. And as we know, there's a very close link between people who've been part of the police, the Fraternal Police Order, and the Ku Klux Klan. In fact, the current orange clown in office in the White House was endorsed by the Fraternal Order of Police. That was, as well as the KKK. So these things are very much they lie in in the same bed. And then there's also this other element, which is in the context of the post-civil rights movement, there's been a rise of Black police officers and Black prosecutors and etc. And James Foreman in Locking Up Our Own goes into detail about that complicated history between the rise of Black police officers who often do the work of white supremacy and what that means. And even with Baltimore, the murder of Freddie Gray, like we're looking at a mostly Black situation. At the same time, and this is where I'm like, okay, this is absolutely wrong. The absolute and very pointed racism that we see happening in this context, in the context of South Bend and this police chief fiasco, goes to show the extent to which Black people within these positions are also just not being respected, honored, that now they can get away perhaps with much more, and that there isn't a kind of transparent system to account for even in the system, and that they see Pete as their own. They see him as fulfilling the policies that they want within the context of the police system.
There's something even deeper when we're talking about liberals in the police, right? Because the liberals come in, and one of the first things they always want to do is align themselves with law and order, right? Because they want to be seen as also as tough, right? Because liberals are, supposed to be snowflakes and so on. And so one of the first things they do, they're like, we're going to be like, law and order. It's like, Bill Clinton signing the crime bill. And so this is where I really draw the line with a lot of liberals, particularly, a lot of white liberals and also Kamala Harris. You know what I mean? Like, when you are given it, that's why when I say, for instance, like, I can't trust them. You know what I mean? And people's like, well, how can you say that? I was like, I've got empirical evidence.
And the thing that it never works to shore up the cred with right-wing people. What this does is, on the one hand, what it does is it just continues to push the discourse ever further to the right on issues of policing. And this is something that is true, I think, of Mayor Pete, not only on this issue of policing, but on so many others, where if you in constantly trying to triangulate between the demands of the right and then whatever it is that you claim to want or support, you end up just moving the discourse ever further to the right over and over again, because you never actually win. You're never going to make those people like you. And just, sorry, I'm on a roll here. Then this connects in some way to this kind of neoliberal gay way of being, because it's like you're never going to make those people like you.
Yeah.
I mean, it just, like, it doesn't... You end up just selling out what it is that you claimed to be for entirely, and
here's also my disconnect.
For nothing.
Right? You never hear people on the right talking about, reaching across the aisle, right? No. It's always the people on the left talking about reaching across the aisle. And it's always like, why do I need to step to them?
Nope.
You know what I mean? The reality is just like, they're wrong, but there's somewhere in the back of your little neoliberal mind that you need to placate these people, right? And that is a real, real, real problem. And that's when you see it with somebody like, like Mayor Pete, and, there was that video where he was talking to the school kids, and he said, like, oh, the people that owned slaves didn't know what they were, what did he say?
I believe he was talking about the
Constitution?
The framers of the Constitution who owned slaves, and said that they, even they had this kind of people who were so wise as to set up this brilliant system of government could also have this blindness, of not knowing that what they were doing was wrong. And the sound that you heard after that was 7,000 historians' heads exploding.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And, and the kids like nodding and going like this. The part that bugged me more than anything else, okay, fine. I'm okay, not okay, but it was like I've heard those kinds of ignorant arguments before. What really annoyed me is watching the white gays in my circle come to me and tried to white-splain to me what he meant by that. And I was like, really, girl? Like, you know what I mean? Like, you're stepping to me to try to tell me what he meant. You're going to interpret his words. I said, I know what words mean. You know what I mean? It's like, this is not new to me. You know what I mean? And for them, when I said to myself, I was like, wow, look at this. Like, this person that was like, you know, at the Eagle with me, and they're turning around and they're trying to convince me that what I'm hearing and what I'm reading isn't really happening. This is what he...
Well, part of the problem is a revisionism that works in the interest of humanizing white supremacists, slave owners who profited off the backs of black people, and also white indentured servants. Like guess I'll say that, and on the land of indigenous people. Let's be honest. Right? I can go on and on, right. And I think beyond that, because I think that it's also important not just to talk about the ways in which people or mayors like Pete fulfill the work of white supremacy through racism and policing, but also how, particularly with Mayor Pete's record, how he's also, his policies as a mayor were not in support of migrants. So in the context of Trump, I said his name, the orange clown in the White House, the 45th, being president, it's also come with a kind of surge of ICE raids, a surge in which migrants or people who are perceived to be migrants can suddenly be under attack, and as well as the kind of steroids of the alleged wall that's being built on the border. And some cities have basically tried to reverse some of those far-right policies by saying, hey, we will become a sanctuary city. We, as a city, will ensure that there are safe spaces in which ICE raids won't just happen, that people who are migrants can feel secure and safe. Of the major cities in Indiana, South Bend, where Mayor Pete is a mayor, is not one of the sanctuary cities in that state. For me, that is a problem. If you want to be in solidarity with migrants, if you want to be in solidarity with people who have faced the tutelage under the current presidential regime, then that actually means having policies and efforts that can say we defend migrants, because otherwise you're just supporting and you're complicit in these policies.
Right. So Mayor Pete's kind of record on policing and race came under new scrutiny as he began to run for president, and then in June of 2019, as the campaign was kind of in full swing. And I just want to pause and say that the fact that this didn't end his presidential campaign is a enormous discredit to white liberals. Not that we didn't know that white liberals were bad, but this is just more evidence. So in June 2019, in South Bend, there is a fatal police shooting, another extrajudicial murder, this time of a man named Eric Logan. And you will be shocked to know that the police officer's dash and body cam wasn't activated. So there's actually no video of this incident and no way to tell what happened beyond the words of the officer. The officer claims that after responding around 3:30 a.m. local time to reports of a man reportedly breaking into cars, that Logan flashed a knife when approached, and that that's when the officer, his name was Officer O'Neill, opened fire. But given that neither the body camera nor the dash camera were turned on, and they should have been, the local black community and local progressives were enraged, and this prompted calls for a federal investigation. And this Mayor Pete's record with the black community on this issue has been reported in BuzzFeed News by Brianna Sachs, and again, the link is in the show notes for people who want to read the whole article. Now, Mayor Pete skipped a vigil at the scene of the shooting and didn't make any public remarks about the incident until the Wednesday after, when he gave a speech to the city's all-white new police cadet class about the importance of transparency and turning on body cameras. Oliver Davis, who is a member of the South Bend Common Council and a veteran local black activist, said, well, he talked to the media before talking to the family. He skipped the family vigil full of black residents, and then he gave a speech to the police. So you tell me how you think that went over. Logan's mother, Shirley Newbill, said that her meeting with the mayor had been brief and frustrating. He didn't say nothing to me, she said. later at a rally, he said, Mayor Pete, one of his campaign rallies, he said, well, it's very sad what happened in South Bend. He said, it's as if one member of our family died at the hands of another. And even as an outside process works to determine what happened, we already know why such wounds are surfacing and why our whole community hurts, end quote. And I think that is even... I mean, I obviously was researching an episode about a show called Bad Gays, so I knew I was not a fan of this person, but that took even me aback, that quote. One member of our family killed by another.
There is always this kind of false equivalence that, that's always being created between the police and the community, right? As if they are in this adversarial relationship, And the reality is just like, no, you work for me. Right? It's like, you work for me. I don't work for you. You work for me. But somehow this thing has been set up as just like, it's me against you. And when he goes there and he says something like, make sure your body cams are on, and he doesn't make any sort of appeal to morals or virtues.
Don't shoot people.
How about that? Yeah, don't.
Try not to murder anybody.
Yeah,
you know what I mean? Like, when you don't address the systemic issues that are prevalent in this, in this society, and you're asking to be a leader, you're asking to be a leader, and you don't address these sort of like really root systemic. And this is the problem. What I find this is why I think that we're never going anywhere. Because white people never call a thing, right? So when he says about both members of our family are hurting, right? It's just like, you've drawn an equivalence, right, between these two things, and they're completely not equivalent.
Yeah, I would also add that part of what I find disturbing about his entire behavior around this incident is that there's a failure to recognize Black humanity. There's a way in which he's not acknowledging how there's an entire system, not just the police, but white vigilantes and the KKK, far-right groups that hunt and murder Black people and other people of color like we're prey. And then even just the sinister language, insidious language is saying, evoking this idea that there's this familial connection between the police and this Black person. It's very similar to the ways in which slave masters evoked familial connections in the 18th, 19th century in the U.S. context. And in many cases they were, because they sexually assaulted Black women, slaves. And it's just... So this
which police are never involved in sexual assault. Women of color,
not
sex workers.
Definitely not.
I can't wait for my mammy to come.
So there's so many layers to why this is so problematic. To and it goes to show that he isn't even pointing to or thinking about the core politics of the Black Lives Matter movement. Like, people are still trying to fight for the fact that our lives do matter, and he can't acknowledge that. He can't acknowledge our lives.
So then one of the responses to this shooting is that they set up a series of 8 meetings, community meetings, with the local Board of Public Safety, which is the police oversight board, with community advisory groups, and he skipped all but one of the 8 to attend presidential campaign events and fundraisers, as The Intercept reported. He was protested at many of his campaign events by local Black Lives Matter groups who were taking the lead of Black Lives Matter South Bend, which was basically calling on him to prioritize dealing with the situation in the city that he was mayor of over attending campaign fundraisers. Black Lives Matter protesters protesting ahead of a debate in Iowa were shouted over by Buttigieg supporters who were shouting chants of USA, USA, USA.
Wow.
Yeah.
They went full nationalism.
So then, responding to this, the campaign put out a series of statements or plans that were attempts to recover his standing with Black voters, who are an important Democratic primary constituency, who are probably the reason why I predict, will not be the presidential nominee, because
we're homophobic.
But well, that's so. The first attempt is they put out a statement. They recycle a racist lie that originates in the aftermath of the success of the anti-gay marriage Prop 8 referendum in California in 2008. At that time, a lot of gay groups, which had basically been thought that they had an easy win on their hands and organized themselves poorly, attempted to excuse their and their consultants' failures to respond to that organization by saying, well, it was just this elevated African-American voter turnout to support the first black president, and as we all know, it's an uncomfortable truth we have to talk about, but there's this increased rate of homophobia among African-Americans, and that's not played out in any research or study or polling. The other thing that they do is they put out this document which is called the Plan for Black America. This is a set of policies which includes things like, you get a discount on your student loans if you start a business in a minority-owned area, stuff like that. And what they do is they, on their list of 400 prominent African-American activists and elected officials who had supported this plan, they put the names of people some of whom had endorsed other presidential candidates, some of whom claimed that they had never read the plan. The way that they got people's endorsement for this plan was by sending out an email saying, if you don't respond within such and such a time, we're going to put you on as an endorser, which is not how you do this. And again, I just can't believe that this issue went away. They faked black support for this plan, and this has just been ignored in the media.
They love him, they want him, and and the reality is, at the end of the day, they don't really care about our issues. They just don't care, and you can see that from 400 years of neglect. So why should they start now? You know what I mean? So he's pushing the corporate, he's pushing the corporate line, and he gives them a feel-good story because
Well, also, I would add that it's absolutely disingenuous to assume that Black people are anti-gay as a monolith when there are Black gay people. And then beyond that, it's just there's an entire history, particularly if we think about the ascension of the Combahee River Collective, which is a Black feminist, mostly lesbian and bisexual women collective of people who were Marxists, socialists, left-leaning, who were part of a civil rights liberation struggle where they were being excluded from the mainstream gay LGBT struggle. And they're like, well, we're Black and we're queer too, and we're here. And many of those people are still alive today, Barbara Smith being one of them. And they're doing amazing work. And so to make an assumption about that is, I would say that that's wrong. And then beyond that, even if we look at popular culture, because we were talking about queer culture and clubbing and stuff like that before, one of the major shows right now, Pose, Billy Porter, Angelica Ross, who's a transgender activist and actress on the show of Pose, has actually had a LGBT gala thing to bring together some of the presidential candidates. This happened some months ago, and so the people are actually Black people, and all these people are Black that I'm mentioning. They're doing that work.
Just yesterday, so this issue has been sort of dogging Mayor Pete throughout his campaign. And just yesterday, at a high-dollar fundraiser in Chicago, a protester interrupted Mayor Pete, identifying as a queer person of color, a queer non-binary person of color. Said people are dying in our community. They were challenging Mayor Pete about not attending those meetings, and Mayor Pete said, quote, "I've got to ask you to respect the format."
Oh no!
So then the protester responded, and I quote, "I need you to respect me and my question and respect the people of South Bend," and then went on to kind of reframe the question. And Mayor Pete replied, quote, "Sometimes love is not expressed by interruption. Sometimes love is expressed in a different way," and repeated his call to respect the format. And I think there is contemporary white neoliberal liberalism in a nutshell. The most important thing, some people are crying out for their lives, and the important thing is respect the format.
I got a couple of things here. Number one, the respect the format. First of all, you don't own the facts and you don't own the rules of engagement. Right? So whose format? This is the format I'm choosing right now. Right? So when you say respect the format, you are imposing, right, this white supremacist system on these people, down in there. And I had this moment, I was writing this article about a bigger story, and I remember coming back to this, tracing from the civil rights movement, and I got to the gay rights movement, and I landed on that thing where their tagline was "Love is love," and I really thought about that, for a really long time, and I thought to myself, not all love is the same, and whether my love is different or not is really not the point here, right? Points of discrimination don't have anything to do with my sameness to you, right? It's absolutely the opposite, right? It's because I'm different from you that you have to respect me, right? So when they are, even in their language, you realize it's the language of assimilation, right? Which for me is the language of contrition, right? And the people that have
bow your head, wait in line, and then you get to ask me the question. And I remember I was working at a major gay group when a Latinx trans activist named Geneset Gutierrez, who had been invited to a White House LGBT activists event, interrupted and heckled President Obama about deportations and the deportations and treatment of trans women who at that time, as now, are often being incarcerated in privately run facilities, being misgendered. And the reaction of all of the nice white gay liberals in my office was, this is the first president we've ever had who's done anything for us, and how dare she stand up and interrupt. And how dare, and I'm thinking, and these are people, here's how far the disconnect goes. These are people who would actually be able to narrate for you what has become now the kind of standard gay left liberal narrative where you sort of performatively narrate, and you performatively narrate the fact that you have it was trans women of color who started Stonewall and Sylvia and Marcia, and they know all of these names. And it's like, this is literally today's Sylvia. How you treat her, how you think about her, when she's saying the inconvenient thing or doing the inconvenient thing is how you would have behaved then. And it just goes to show how far right this whole movement has moved, where that interruption was perceived in that social circle, which is very much the Mayor Pete social circle, as we kind of discussed, this kind of gay nonprofit, official gay rights world, that the most important thing is to respect the format, and basically, people like that, in quotes, should just take the sort of little bits that they're given.
And I think I would say also beyond that, what's particularly disturbing about him saying sometimes love is not expressed by interruption, I guess I would want to share a quote by a good gay, African-American writer, James Baldwin, where his interpretation of love is, quote, "Love does not begin and end the way we seem to think it does. Love is a battle. Love is a war. Love is a growing up." And I would argue that Pete needs to grow up. He needs to grow up and actually with the times to understand the absolute concern that what people are describing, Black folk who are being murdered, people in his community who don't feel like they're being fully represented, they can't just be pushed aside and pushed away. For actual liberation to happen, that does mean challenging the structure of that be. And that meant for slaves in the 19th century in the Americas, basically escaping, running away. That was technically illegal, which is why they created the fugitive. It was illegal. It was illegal. It was illegal, and moving your body so that you could be free was illegal. Today, activism is putting your body on the line to say, we are going to protect migrants. We are going to ensure that people are not being shot. We're going to interrupt a speech. That is a very mild act of all things to do.
Of all the things
so
possibly
mild,
do.
So mild.
And there was an image I remember that was taken by, I think, a reporter who was attending this LGBT town hall from the back. And I thought this was an image that just summed up the last 30 years of the gay rights movement. And in the image you saw Black trans women who had not been allowed to ask a question, who were being removed from the venue by police. And then up on stage, you see Pete Buttigieg and Anderson Cooper, two epitome A-gays, standing there looking just like deers in the headlights, looking out. And what I realized is literally the lights blind. You see the lights are blinding them in the image, and they can't quite see what's going on, and so that's why they look a little confused. And that's they're just blinded. And I don't it's not they have chosen to be blinded. It's like they have chosen to keep themselves innocent of or ignorant of these realities for Black people, for working people, and then that kind of wraps into the place that I want to kind of conclude this conversation by spending a little time on, which is not to move the conversation away from race, because race is an integral part of all of these policies that I want to talk about, but to talk a little bit about...
Race is a deal breaker also.
But to talk a little bit about the policy platform that Mayor Pete has presented as a presidential candidate and what his kind of function has been in the race. And what's interesting is, and Mac, you pointed out earlier, you said, I operate by instinct. I sort of knew this person, and I knew this is somebody with no convictions. This is somebody who was just going to do kind of whatever it was. So in 2018, at the beginning of the presidential campaign, when he, or before I think he even was officially running, but when he was sort of beginning to think about running, he said on Twitter there were people who were trying to heckle people as to whether they supported Medicare for all. And he said, and I'm quoting here, "I, Pete Buttigieg, politician, do henceforth and forthwith declare affirmatively and indubitably into the ages that I do favor Medicare for all, as I do favor any measure that would help get all Americans covered," end quote. And then he ends up like, now I have to go back to being mayor, but like, fine, yes, I agree with you, absolutely, whatever. Then, over the course of the summer of 2019, he emerged as a kind of key attacker or a key kind of arguer against policies that have been put forward by some of the presidential candidates, most notably Senator Sanders, that would bring single-payer healthcare to the U.S. And now he claims he was never in favor of single-payer healthcare. And he's gotten spent a lot of time and energy at the debates trying to carve himself out this sort of moderate position and oppose these plans. And when he does that, just as when he opposes things like free higher education or student debt reduction, he ends up kind of bringing right-wing talking points about whether it's I trust people to know what they want to do with their health care. And it's like, yes, but you have never sat there looking at the healthcare choices that are available for you and your family and had to make the decision between, okay, so this year, am I going to have a healthcare plan where I can't really afford to put gas in the car, but if I get sick, I won't go bankrupt? Or I can pay for the gas, but then if I do get sick, I will go bankrupt. Like, you've just never... So that to you is meaningful choice, when that to most people is not meaningful choice. And they just... bringing attacks from a generation of politics that he claims to want to leave behind, because so much of his message is about generational transformation, that if you want to leave behind this generation of failed Democratic Party politics, of failed neoliberalism, of failed attempts to move to the center, of two presidents, Clinton and Obama, who failed on every issue, on every account, to change the direction of the United States in any meaningful way whatsoever. Anything good they did was tinkering around the edges and easily reversed, and they collaborated in a whole lot of bad. And if you are claiming that you want to actually change that direction, if you're just going to repeat these stale talking points about choice and about competition and about freedom, all of which are talking points that are literally invented by Republican strategists in the 1980s and the 1990s to argue against the kind of social democratic measures that people want to bring back, you're not representing any kind of transformation. And that's why, in a way, it's more insidious to me than even someone like Joe Biden, because Biden is just of this neoliberal era, and Buttigieg, if he won, would be in some way a kind of re-endorsement of it, or its emergence into a new era.
So just like I was saying before, like, I know that queen, right? And you know how I know that queen? Because she's on Debate Club, right?
Yep.
And how Debate Club works is just like, oh, this is what we're talking about. Pick a side and defend that side, right? So it doesn't actually come from any place of actual conviction, right? It's just about winning the argument. And so here is my biggest disconnect between the Mayor Petes of the world and people like us, is that I believe in justice. And justice is about right and wrong. People like Mayor Pete believe in power. And power is all about winning and losing. When you've got nothing to lose, doesn't matter, right? Like,
Yeah, I think also what I would add to this is that there's just been a massive polarization between those who've benefited from the economic crisis and those who continue to be dealing with the pitfalls of it. If we think about some of the major issues that have come up in the recent presidential campaign talking points, student loan debt and why people want debt forgiveness. There's a $1.5 trillion debt
It's bigger than
in the
mortgage,
U.S.
right?
Yeah, it's bigger than
mortgages,
and this is like one of the many debts that have occurred, including medical debt, etc., personal debt. People are living off of a credit card system to survive, and to have a kind of what appears to be on his part an immunity from the suffering of millions of people living in the United States is a very maybe not devious act, but it's just cold-hearted.
And you want to pose the continuation of that suffering as freedom. Like you want, like it's like it's Orwellian.
And his supporters want me to like him because he's gay. Like that.
I think partially. I mean, I think there definitely was a
This is our moment. Get behind us. It's just like there's a disconnect here, boo.
Yeah. And then
he's technically, so for me, what's so odd about him is he's technically a millennial, and when I think about myself as a millennial, as someone who's been radicalized in a particular way, one of the major turning points is the U.S. invasion in Iraq and Afghanistan, and how when that happened in 2003, my entire liberal arts college, basically, or not all of it, but most of it, went to the Burnside Bridge in Portland, Oregon, and occupied it, and people put their little bodies on the lines. And there's so much activism that's been happening over the past like 15, 20 years, and to not acknowledge that there is a kind of financial gap and that people are hungry for an alternative, which is why you have the popularity of people like someone like Bernie. And I support, for full disclosure, I'm biased, like I support Bernie Sanders and what he's calling for more so than I would ever support someone like Pete, because his politics and the class he comes from, as well as the class he's standing for, has nothing to do with me.
And the class he stands for, I think, is clear by the financing strategy of his campaign, where they're accepting high-dollar donations, they're accepting bundlers. They were very reluctant to release lists of who their bundlers were, just as they were very reluctant to release lists of who his clients actually were at McKinsey. When they did end up releasing that, some reporting has come out that he may have been involved in a bread price-fixing scandal in Canada at McKinsey, so I'm sure there's some unsavory names on the bundlers list as well. And he's referring to these donors as investors, which, again, to go back to this question of language, I think is really important and fascinating, because what are they investing in? When you invest, you expect a return. What do they think they're going to get? They obviously think they're going to get something, and so when billionaires collect in a wine cave and spend thousands of dollars on tickets and they're investing in the success of this candidate, what is it that they're investing in?
But I would, and this is where we have to think about power.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, his positionality is someone who has power and has the power to make decisions, and what we have seen the evidence for is to ruin lives.
Yeah.
That is the critique. It is not the critique about who you decide to love, how you identify, what your gender orientation is, etc. It is like, what is the power that you hold? Who are you supporting, and how does that get exercised to cause real damage? And there's plenty of evidence for that, and that's the point of interest.
People's decisions define their character, right? And when I see someone like him, when you're not willing to put yourself on the front line, then guess what? You can't be in the top seat, right? So if you didn't put yourself out there, you know what I mean? And there's like, trans people of color, really living out loud, making it possible for you to even, run for president, and you've got no love for them, right? I got a problem with that. Because you know what? You can't take the, all the good things without actually having exerted any energy.
And this is where maybe imagination is really important. Can we I would love a socialist gay utopia where people could just be able to share responsibility, where there wouldn't be hierarchies. It would just, and sure. This is, he's not on that plane.
But I just, the last thing I said, since we're in Berlin, right? I'll just bring this back to Berlin. And this is one of those instinctual moments for me. Because years and years ago, there was this thing on Grindr about people that were taking their Grindr profile pics, at the
Holocaust Memorial.
The Holocaust
Memorial. Jews of Europe.
And when I saw that douchebag picture of Mayor Pete standing in the memorial and
posing on his husband's Instagram,
and then his pose and goes, that guy.
Yeah,
Like
the husband.
Even,
that's the
yeah,
husband.
Not even
Jason
really,
commented,
not
that
even
guy.
having any kind of, stripping it of all context. I was just like, you're a douchebag.
And that's the final comment that I'll make, and the way I'll bring this episode to a close is, so at one point during the campaign, they released one of their policy platforms, and it was the LGBT policy platform, and it was called Becoming Whole, and, gay Twitter had a nice laugh about that name. Yeah. But I do actually think that there is, as I said, there are kind of wrong ways to be gay and gay ways to be wrong, and one particular gay way to be wrong is this kind of a gay subjectivity where really you require this kind of power and this kind of state recognition to conceive of yourself as whole, and then in your struggle to become whole, whatever else gets in the way, it doesn't matter. It all comes back to the struggle of that individual person to achieve power, and that's what I think we see in his biography. That's what I think he presents to us as a presidential candidate, and this episode is coming out before the Iowa caucuses, so hopefully our friends and neighbors and listeners who live in the United States can talk to their friends, can talk to their family, can spread the word about this guy, and hopefully we don't have to face down seeing this person in meaningful political office. Thank you, Mac. Thank you, Edna, so much for joining us for this, I think, really rich and digressive and interesting conversation about a lot of things. I want to ask if either of you have stuff coming up that our listeners might be interested in or could find or access. Edna, there's your fabulous podcast, again, called Decolonization in Action. But
yeah, if you are interested in learning more about decoloniality, I have a Decolonization in Action podcast that I've run with my co-host, Christina Comer. And if you're in the Berlin area, I am, along with my collaborator, Nena Anahuya, we will be having an exhibition in Berlin on the 14th of February that opens at the Alpha Nova Futura Galerie in Kreuzberg. So please check that out.
And I'm in a bit of a transition phase at the moment where I'm transitioning from a place of fashion to a place of art. But my first project, actually, is I'm writing a one-man show for myself based on the radical queer march that we had here in Berlin and how they called the cops on the Palestinians. And it's all sort of like that's the nexus of this story that I talk about, the gay rights, the gay liberation movement, going from a place where black and brown people were rioting against the police to white people calling the police on brown people. And I think that's kind of like a full circle moment.
You can follow the show on Twitter at BadGaysPod. You can follow me on Twitter at Ben Writes Things. You can follow Edna on Twitter at Jacobin Noir. You can visit us at patreon.com/BadGaysPod to sign up to support the show so that we can make more special episodes like this. And I also want to announce that we are recording the third regular season of our show in late February. And so look for those episodes to air starting sometime in March of 2020. Thank you so much for listening.
This is DJ Sentiment Emily, and you're listening to Subtext on Threads Radio.